Thanks for coming, Zach. Thanks everybody for showing up tonight. Thanks to all of our live streamers and those tuning into video and podcast versions of this program tonight. Zach, thanks for joining us. I know that you've been zipping all over the place on airplanes, so we really appreciate you coming back to New York to talk with us tonight.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. So Zach is the author of a book called Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. So what we wanted to do tonight is unpack some of those concepts and ask how new generational dynamics in both China and Korea, a bit of a compare and contrast type discussion, are pushing society to change in some expected and unexpected ways. And I think we can have really interesting conversations. So Zach, could you just start by telling us a little bit about how you got your interest in China to begin with, how you ended up there as a 20-year-old?
Sure. So I spent the first 18 years of my life in California. I grew up in the suburbs of Berkeley and came to New York, actually. I went to Columbia and took one semester of Chinese, the first semester of my freshman year, and absolutely loathed it more than just about any class I've ever taken. In fact, it remains to this day the worst grade I've ever gotten. Skipped for 2 months, was planning on never going back, realized I couldn't drop it, and then managed to pass the final, but never considered taking it again. But because of that one class, when it came time to study abroad, I had some options in front of me. I'm a big science fiction fan, and so I was sort of looking at where I could go based on my language abilities. I could go to France and study history, really, the past. Or go to Hong Kong, and because of that one semester, I passed the language requirements, and see where everyone was saying the future was happening. When you set it up like that, it's sort of an easy decision. I was the only study abroad student there with a multi-entry visa, so I traveled often on my own to mainland China, particularly Shenzhen, but actually all around as well, and realized very quickly that the China that I was seeing and experiencing was very different than the China that was being described to me. And when I say described to me in the media, and even reverberating off of people who had spent a week in Shanghai to make a deal and then came back and understand China. And so interestingly, the more time I spent in China, rather than being more clarifying, it was actually more confusing. And I realized the big key to that was the language. Even years on now, I realize sort of sadly that many people who comment on China and even write about China don't have the ability to speak to Chinese people. And that's the part that's missing in a lot of our conversation around China. We usually talk about two things. First, we talk about a big sort of bad government, which is scary. We talk about a fireworks economy, which is exciting. But we don't really talk about people at all. We don't really have a conversation about, what does the world look like from a seat in China? And that version of China is what I was most interested in. I came back, I graduated. At Columbia, we are all artists until senior year. So I thought I was going to be a consultant. Honestly, I was in a Bain interview when I more or less snapped and decided to go back to China. I went with a backpack, an address of a hostel, no job. I didn't know anybody. My plan was to learn the language fast and try to get as deep into China as I could. I also went, to be totally candid, because I was worried about being a sort of soft suburban Ivy League brat my whole life, if just to
Sure.
put it all on the table.
A little adventure, also very people-focused interest in the culture and the difference between what had been portrayed and then what you actually experienced in person.
I wanted to
Totally
bridge
get
the
it.
gap.
Sure thing. So I want to talk a little bit today, if we could start with the media, because I think that media trends tell us a lot about a culture, where it's going, where it's been, and how it's changed. I started preparing for this program tonight by talking with a group of graduate students at Columbia University. This program, by the way, is co-sponsored by Columbia University's APEC Study Center, and we're joined by Taylor Cook today. So thank you so much for your sponsorship and your help. So I was talking to these students, did a very unscientific poll, and we'll look into the results of that in a little bit. But one of the things that we talked about was shifting media trends. So what I had identified in Korea was that you had movies and you had dramas. The movies were pretty serious. They tackled real serious social issues. And the television shows had a lot of variety shows, a lot of makjang dramas, soap operas, and shows that are, makjang means like last stop. So it couldn't possibly get any more ridiculous. So these are shows that are escapist in nature. But recently, there's been a trend towards television shows in South Korea that are much more serious and that tackle serious social issues. Sky Castle for SKY, Seoul National University, Korea University, Yonsei University, the three most attractive universities that everybody wants to go to. And the rigors of the intellectual and educational competition there that make social relationships tough and that really define life in a lot of ways. Another popular one is Misang, which is adapted from a webtoon, this online comic book cartoon basically, and it shows the rigors of what it's like to work in a Korean office environment, how tough that is, what the daily difficulty of it is. But it's not escapist. It's not something that you do at the end of the day to just blow off steam and imagine that you're a princess or a prince. It's something that you use as a microscope to examine your own social values. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how media trends in China are shifting, how the young generation's preferences are pushing that change, if you've noticed dynamics that are similar to that which have happened in Korea.
I'm by no stretch of the imagination a Korea expert. Over the last 7 or 8 years in particular, media has shifted pretty seismically in China. One of the largest seismic shifts is that the TV has gotten pretty good. It used to be that a lot of TV in China wasn't unwatchable, but wasn't far from unwatchable. And over the last 8 years, there's been a really strong push, not in small part actually because of the strength of Korea's media program, or not program, that you can clearly have spent a lot of time in China, the quality of what Korea puts out into the world. China, there was a fear there that, okay, you have young people who are trying to watch Breaking Bad or Korean dramas. And so where is the space for promoting what is really forming now as a modern Chinese sense of self? I actually think this is what this conversation is about, by the way, which is right now China has sort of a shifting set of tectonic plates. On one hand, there's this sense of tradition, what sort of China has always been, this idea of family values, this incredible 5,000 years of history, a really strong sense of self that certainly gets reiterated through China's history classes and, of course, through propaganda as well, but a legitimate sense of self. On the other hand, you have the pressures of modernity, right? You have what it's like to live in an urbanized city. You have a new demographic structure that has never existed in Chinese history. China's demography used to look like a pyramid, a lot of kids, very few old people. That's flipped itself on its head. And so you have all these questions now. What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be a good child? What does it mean to fall in love? Love wasn't really a thing 60 years ago in China. And a lot of those conversations are articulating themselves in modern media. And so right now, I think one of the more interesting spaces to pay attention to is actually less some drama, but absolutely reality shows. And the show that really paved the way for that is a show called Shuo. I don't know if anyone here has seen it. Shuo is the first really popular Wangju streaming TV show. It created the space for it in China in around 2013. It's sort of, Shuo means weirdo talks. It's a debate show. It's a show that could probably never take off in the United States. It basically took two teams of contestants who are all weirdos in their own right. Chipa literally means exotic flower. And they would debate social issues, really important social issues. For instance, is it better to have a small apartment in a large city or a large apartment in a small city? Which in China right now, the housing market and this fight for resources and this sense that you have to be going into a first tier city and striving. I mean, this is a question that's truly at the core of the psyche of young people, and it's being hotly debated on TV.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between housing and dating?
Yeah, so this is a great example. You know, I run an organization now called Young China Group, and our basic thesis is that to a far greater degree than most people realize, cultural identity drives economic outcomes. And this is a great example. So you can't truly understand China's real estate market unless you understand China's marriage market. What do I mean by that? In China, there's always been the sense that, okay, when a family begins, they strike out on their own. A young man or a young woman typically lived at home until they were married. That made a lot of sense when people were marrying at 18, which was the age that most people married at throughout all of Chinese history. So that once they were married, they would, move to the plot next door, start farming, the hectare next to their parents, and that would be life. Now things are a little bit different. So in order to be seen as an eligible bachelor, young men not have to, but it's more or less social rule that they have to own property. Buy an apartment in typically a first or second or third tier city or wherever they're living. So they're not seen as an eligible bachelor until they own property. 7 out of 10 of the least livable cities in the world based on housing market compared to average income are in China. What does that mean? That means that the housing in most of these cities is wildly out of reach for an average worker. So what happens is these young men who feel like they have to form a family in order to make their parents happy. Honestly, this is a sense of being 孝顺, of being filially pious, of doing the right thing, of forming a family, of checking that box. In order to make their parents happy, they're actually having to borrow from their parents, something that's called 啃老. It's translated as a parent eater. They're borrowing from their parents to purchase an apartment and therefore be seen as an eligible bachelor. So China's housing market is extraordinarily resilient, and everyone's been saying bubble for the last decade, but it's really been propped up on what is a truly resilient marriage market and the necessity of providing 安全感, or a feeling of safety or security in the form of a house. So you have a lot of these cultural necessities that have evolved in the modern world. I mean, it used to be buying an apartment. What's an apartment? I mean, people weren't living, China wasn't an urbanized space, but now you have this pressure of modernity mixed with this sort of traditional sense of what does it mean to have a sense of security for the female side of the relationship. And those tectonic plates are grinding at this young generation. I talk a lot about young China. There's 417 million millennials in China, 417 million. That's 5 times more than we have here in the United States. It's actually more people than we have in the United States and Canada combined. There are more young people in China than there are young people in North America, the Middle East, and Europe combined. And so when you start to talk about these cultural tropes, you're not talking about something that influences 500,000 people or 20 million people. You're talking about something that is influencing massive swaths of the population, who feels, honestly, there's a more unified sense of self, of what it means to be Chinese now, than there probably is in any other country in the world, including the only really comparable massive population in India, who still is fairly completely fractured by regional differences. It's a really unique set of circumstances that make this young generation in China pretty globally unique in what they're facing.
And so perhaps because of the tension between modernity and traditions, the values coming up against the expectations and just the difficulty of accelerating and achieving success in a society like that, I think we're seeing some resistance against that. And the television show which exemplifies that is All Is Well. And you confessed to me that you had watched 45 hours of this show. So could you tell us a little bit about All Is Well?
Life.
Yeah.
So I first want to preface this by saying I often get asked questions about language learning. And for those who wonder how to learn language the fastest, I'm a terrible language learner. I managed to pass the highest level of fluency you can test for in Mandarin in about 2 years, and that's not because I'm a skilled language learner. I did a good amount of research into accelerated language learning, and TV is the absolute best thing you can do. It simulates. You have auditory cues, you have context clues, it's the closest you can get to immersion without immersion. So I watch an embarrassing amount of Chinese TV. Please don't hold that against me. So 都挺好, All Is Well, is a show that got incredibly popular. By the way, incredibly popular in China, just for reference. Last year's NBA playoffs got around 10 to 15 million viewers. The last super popular show in China, it was a rap show, a rap reality show, got 200 million viewers. So just to, again, what does popular mean from place to place? 都挺好, this show, All Is Well, it's about family dynamics. It's a lot about intergenerational interaction. I think a lot of our sort of rom-coms or even dramas, and this show kind of spans both. It's often about a couple. What does it mean? What does love in the big city look like? What's interesting about this show, it's about 3 children, their interaction with their parents. mother passes away, and it's about the question of who's going to be xiaoshun, who's going to be filially pious, who's going to look after the father. And so it would be without the parents. And this is, by the way, is very similar with many Chinese dramas. The love life itself is actually quite normal. But as soon as you bring in the in-laws, as soon as you bring in the parents, and the question of, okay, who's going to pay for who's going to look after the parents, who's going to pay for their apartment that they're going to buy for them, who are we going to invite into our homes to live with us? Because these are the societal expectations in China, and those are unique to China versus especially here in the West. I don't know that they're unique compared to South Korea. So the show Dou Tinghao, All Is Well, got incredibly popular in China because it took head on some of these issues of, okay, what does it mean to be filially pious today? I really don't like this translation because I would never say, I'm going to run home to California and be filially pious to my dad. But in China, it is something that you would conversationally talk about. I'm going to go home and make sure to be xiaoshun. I'm going to xiaojing wo ba. I'm going to be filially pious to my father. And so the show really takes that full on, like, what does it look like in the modern world? Because it used to be far easier. In 1950, so as recently as 1950, modern China began in 1949. That was when Mao founded the People's Republic of China. In 1950, there was between 5 and 6 children per family, and the average life expectancy was 40. So not only did you have 5 siblings to help look after your parents, but your parents weren't retiring, they died. An incredible longevity revolution took place. So China's life expectancy went from 40 and it's now 75 years old. Just think about that, by the way. We think a lot about, okay, China has definitely moved from poverty, but 35 years added to life expectancy in the span of 60 years is absolutely unbelievable. We've never seen anything like that in the medical community in the modern world today. On top of that, because of the world's largest baby bust, China's demographic pyramid, which is really the foundation of Confucian society, right? You have a broad base of young people who are able to solidly and stably support the top. That demographic pyramid has turned itself on its head. And so if you want to know really the crux of most of China's issues, I don't care if it's politically, I don't care if it's economically, how are you going to create sources of growth? I don't care if it's socially, I don't care if it's spiritually. Most of those issues actually come back to this issue of demography, because that upside down pyramid acts like a funnel. It's a funnel for love. It's a funnel for resources, right? These single children at the bottom of this upside down pyramid are often called xiao huangdi, little emperors, kids spoiled rotten by an excess of attention, of resources. It's also a funnel for pressure, an incredible amount of pressure bearing down on this one child, expectations to succeed, expectations to get ahead on the college market, on the job market, on the marriage market, and all of those are fiercely competitive. And so this young generation has a really unique task that no generation in Chinese history has ever had, which is to sort of juggle these traditional expectations against these pressures of modernity, which have never arisen in Chinese history before. It's an entirely unique set of circumstances. And these shows like Dou Tinghao are actually taking those issues on head on. And the young generation is hotly debating, what does it mean to be Chinese today?
Thanks. Yeah. So at the same time that these young people are navigating their own lives, they're also living as part of a society. Mm-hmm. And part of living in a society means participating in a national discourse or having access to a national discourse. In South Korea, of course, we've got a real flourishing civil society. The press is imperfect, but it's well established and well functioning. The candlelight movement, of course, is one example of civil society acting really strong. Unions are really strong in South Korea. And there's a rich tradition going back from the Gwangju uprising in 1980 and moving forward to people responding against authoritarianism. Now in China, as far as I know, there's still significant impediments to having a frank national discourse about the politics. But there's a bit of a cat and mouse game emerging with netizens who come up with code words to talk about things like the Tiananmen Square and to talk about the leadership like Xi Jinping. But it's coded, it's clever, and it's a game. But there's an interest in engaging on topics about what a fair society looks like and how we can move in that direction. Can you tell us a little, unpack some of those issues and explore that for us?
So over the last decade, civil society in China has evolved, has expanded, and is now contracting. There's a lot of conversation about these last 2 years in China because it looked for a while that the pendulum was swinging towards a freer society, a more open society. And now over these last 2 years, it appears that that pendulum is swinging back. I'll give you an example. It used to be that the government was truly sort of like a bumbling old fuddy-duddy, how do you use the internet sort of censoring body. An example I think is great, and it shows sort of the creativity and what used to be a really flourishing netizen community. And it hasn't evaporated, but it used to be far more flourishing. So I remember in Guangzhou, I think it was either Guangzhou or Shenzhen. Urbanization was a major force. It continues to be a major force, but it was a newer force in the early 2010s. And so people were flooding into the cities, and this influx of all these people from the countryside and people from all over the country seeking opportunities meant that the GDP in that area was double-digit growth every single year. But really high GDP growth also meant that the price of pork, the price of groceries, the price of apartments were all skyrocketing. So people were taking to the web to criticize, GDP growth is ruining my life. And the censors, being the sort of not particularly evolved species that they used to be, would just take the word GDP and be like, okay, you can no longer say that. And so if you were trying to write GDP, it would just say, error. You can't do that. And so being, Chinese being the incredible homophone-rich, punning language that it is, people started talking and taking to the web about the scourge of chicken farts. Chicken farts, and forgive me, but chicken farts are just ruining my livelihood. They're ruining my quality of life. They're impacting my kids' ability to get good tutoring. And that's because in Chinese, chicken farts is ji the pi. And so there was all of these, it was sort of like a game of whack-a-mole. We'd strike out GDP, chicken farts is going to rise up. You're going to knock that down and something else comes up. And it was always the government was 2 steps behind. That's not the case anymore. These last 2 years, there's been a far more effective, and just taking a step back, how many people here have WeChat on their phones? How many people here use it more than 4 hours a day? So you all use it less than the average user who's 37 or younger. Does everyone know what WeChat can do for the most part? Would it be instructive to sort of talk about that?
Yeah, maybe just a basic explanation of what it does. Yeah, it might be helpful.
Just because we talk a lot about Chinese innovation. I was at Harvard Business Review this morning talking about that, but not a lot of people really understand what it looks like. What does a super app look like? And WeChat's interesting because it emerged specifically in response to a sort of culture of censorship, because it's a lot of, rather than just being one platform talking to thousands of people, it's a lot of interactions individually. So say you come to Chengdu. John, I'm so happy to have you. Chengdu is where I was based for 3 years. It's a second home for me. I'm going to invite you out to dinner, so we're going to be texting on WeChat. I'm going to send him voice messages on WeChat, so similar to iMessage. We can video chat. It's similar to FaceTime. Still haven't left the app. I'm going to start looking for places for us to eat. Yelp functionality all through WeChat. I'm actually going to order you an Uber once I find a place, or it's going to be a Didi in China.
Thanks.
Just, you don't know what you're doing. You're a guest. Make sure he gets there okay. I still haven't left the app. I'm going to drive there. On my way there, I'm going to book a parking space outside of the restaurant to make sure that I have a place to go. I still haven't left the app of WeChat. We're going to get there. I'm going to look through the menu all through WeChat. I'm going to look at if there's any special deals on kaoyu, so barbecued fish. It's my favorite thing to eat in Chengdu. Sort of Groupon functionality. It's all in WeChat. We're going to take some selfies, and I'm going to post them. Like, John, I'm so happy to have him in town. This is the only moment, by the way, that WeChat has functioned like a normal social app, like Facebook or Instagram. I'm going to post it. People are like it. I'm going to feel good. Millennials are the same everywhere. Afterwards, I'm going to pay through WeChat. We still haven't left the app. I'm going to send him home through WeChat. Still, it's the same Uber functionality. And if I've had too much to drink, I'm going to order what's called a daijia, which is someone who comes up on a scooter and drives me in my car back to my apartment to make sure I don't drive drunk. I still haven't left the app. And at this point, I've only used about maybe 5% of WeChat's functionality. So when we talk, and when I talk to a lot of my Chinese friends who come to the States to study abroad or who come here to visit and see us carrying around wallets and sort of bumbling around for PIN codes and counting dollars, it feels quaint. Because since 2015, China's been almost entirely cashless. And particularly in the mobile space, China makes Silicon Valley, who's still trying to figure out ways to optimize laundry apps, feel like they're missing the boat. But to get back to this conversation around censorship, these last 2 years, particularly even this last 6 months, the government has taken stronger stances and actual measures to build up a censorship team. Which means that there are people and lots of people actually actively employing people, as well as, of course, a mix of AI-driven tools that intelligently seek out certain types of content that are seen as being unsocial. And that list of unsocial is expanding. So we talked media before. China's biggest show, I think in 2017, was a rap show. I mentioned it before. The second season of the rap show, there was a little bit of concern about rap getting too popular. They were spreading ideas that were not particularly considered pro-social in China. And so some of those ideas were tattoos. So all of these guys who had all these pretty cool rapper tattoos suddenly had to wear sleeves or cover them up entirely. It used to be that in a lot of Chinese media, you were starting to get sort of effeminate male characters suggesting that they might be homosexual. There was the role of sort of like the girl's best friend sort of character. That character is no longer allowed in China. This was in the last year and a half. Most recently, there's been I have a good amount of friends who actually are actors within China. Most recently, there's you can't have an earring. Men can't wear earrings anymore. That apparently was the last month. Within China, because that is seen as something that is a little bit not within the moral system that the party is trying to promote. So there's been this swing back that has a lot of people who are very optimistic, unnerved.
I wanted to go through some of the very, again, unscientific survey questions.
And I haven't seen these, by the way, so this will be
You'll get a real reaction, a fresh, authentic reaction. So here we're looking at this question: what is the younger generation's most fundamental concern? So the red bars are the Korean students' responses, and the blue bars are the Chinese students' responses. So the first one is getting a good job, and they were pretty evenly interested in that. Taking care of aging parents, you see a greater proportion of the Korean students. And then personal happiness, which wasn't even on my list of most fundamental concerns before one of the students said, hey, what about us? What about our own happiness? And so we added that, and that got a lot of responses. This sort of tied in with another notion that I found very surprising when talking to the student group to prepare for tonight's program, which was most of them were coming to America to study at Columbia University for the first time. And they had lived in China or Korea and had not really come to America for extended periods before. So I asked them, what was the adaptation period like? Was it difficult for you? And a lot of them, their response was, no, not that hard. We've been exposed to these ideas. We're familiar with them before. Nothing was really that surprising to us. And this struck me as interesting because my own experience when I went to live in Korea for 4 years was, wow, this is really different. This is pretty difficult. For me, going from an individualist-oriented culture to a collectivist-oriented culture required a lot of difficult soul-searching. I had to eat a lot of humble pie, and I had to orient myself to, okay, my identity comes from my place in this social interaction. So I had to be much more perceptive to social cues. I had to be much more cognizant of everyone's Confucian relationship with one another. And only when I had grasped that and I had gotten control of that, mostly through language learning, as you wisely suggested before, that I could finally find myself having felicitous social interactions. But for a lot of these students, they were exposed to these ideas beforehand. Perhaps it was through the media, or perhaps because their own societies are changing so much. But personal happiness was the highest ranking score. So I found that surprising. What do you think, Zach?
The questions I would have for this So first, when we consider the study abroad community, particularly from China, probably more so than Korea, just statistically, it is within society a more privileged group.
Sure.
Only 9% of the Chinese population has a passport. Only 9%. 2/3 of those are under the age of 37, so they're considered millennials. China, by the way, is the largest outbound tourism spender in the world. So you have one generation currently redefining the industry of global travel. A lot of people ask me, why should I care about young China? The answer is impact. Whatever industry you're in, whatever neighborhood you're in. I don't care if you're interested in international real estate, or why is it the real estate prices in New York next to, the apartment you're looking at in Brooklyn suddenly is twice as high. It's the same reason. It's because of young China. So all things that are worth paying attention to. And so this study abroad community, 1/3 of all students studying abroad in the United States are from China, 1 in 3. So another industry that's more or less being propped up entirely by Chinese foreign exchange students. South Korean students are actually incredibly overrepresented.
Number one by proportion to population of the country.
Incredible.
Sheer volume number, it's Chinese students.
There's actually another, this is a number I love. So I often talk about the project of childhood, and then this is a bit of a segue. When I say the project of childhood, I think, what is a childhood for? What is a childhood used for? When I was a kid, again, suburbs of California, I remember being on swim team. When I was on swim team, my friends in China, they were studying. I remember playing video games with my friends or having sleepovers. Really great. My friends in China, that same time, they were studying. I talk to my friends, I'd be calling them on the weekends or going to play soccer. That's really cool. My friends in China were studying. So you think about what a childhood is for. What's the project of childhood? It's so distinct, and a great number that's really interesting to illustrate that. There was a study about myopia, about nearsightedness, and it showed that in Western cultures, particularly focusing on the United States and Germany, college students, as they were graduating from the United States and Germany, had about a 40% rate of myopia. 40%. Students from China had a 90% rate of myopia. South Korea, 96%. Singapore. There's a relationship between types of study cultures and what it does to think about that. It's the composite of every single day of your life. What are you doing? Are you indoors? Are you outdoors? Are you studying? Are you not? Are you looking at something that's close to you? Are you hanging out with your friends and playing ball? It's literally just the function of what are you doing every day added up for 18 years of your life. And so we try to think about what a childhood is for. By the time they get to the study abroad students get to United States, most of them have been studying English for 10 years. I have a wonderful intern right now at the Young China Group he speaks incredible English. He's from Qingdao. And you could start and stop any single episode of Friends. Friends has 10,000 seasons? You could start and stop any single episode, and he can tell you the next line. There's a fluency in outside culture that comes from a curiosity. I think we forget that for many of this young generation, the United States specifically was the foil for China's rise. I can tell you a little story about that. In 1996, it was the first time a lot of my friends in China had ever seen the United States. It was the Atlanta Olympics, 1996. A friend in particular, Wen Tao, remembers going to a next-door neighbor's house in Sichuan because his family couldn't afford a TV, and watching on sort of a boxy black and white thing the opening ceremony. He remembers his mom tapping him on the shoulder and pointing at the screen and saying, "Look, there's America. It's the strongest, most powerful country in the world." She had grown up with the slogans "Chao Ying Gan Mei," surpass England, catch up with America. Where was England? Where was America? The older generation hadn't left the province, let alone the country. But there was this concept of a city on a hill, of a country that we should aspire to being more like, that was outside somewhere. And this was young Wen Tao, who was seeing it for the first time as a 6-year-old. Per capita GDP in 1996 was around $500. That year, the United States won 44 gold medals and China won 16, which was a coup for a very young, immature athletic program at the time. You fast forward to 2008, 12 years later, not that much down the line. Wen Hao is now 18 years old. Beijing Olympics. Does everyone remember the opening to the Beijing Olympics?
Sure.
You remember? It's widely considered to be the most incredible show that the human species has ever put on in terms of scale, in terms of level of coordination. And we often talk about that as a coming out party to the rest of the world. It was, but it was also a coming out party to China. Because the older generation, Wen Tao's parents, remembers a poor China, remembers the China of their youth, remembers the sick man of Asia, remembers the country that was inferior to the rest of the world. And so seeing, 2008 drums beating in lockstep, seeing what looks to be a coordinated glide towards the future, for people within China, that was a significant reprogramming, especially the older generation. So Wen Tao, who his entire life has now seen a lifetime of growth, a lifetime of change. We think about China's rapid growth in terms of macroeconomic numbers, but what about in terms of your uncle getting a better job, your family's apartment shifting? You're no longer looking at that clunky black and white TV next door. Suddenly you have a flat screen at home. That year, China won 51 gold medals and the United States won 36. What's the value of a gold medal? Not much. But what's the value of pride? What's the value of a sort of redefined sense of self? What's the value of no longer maybe just being the underdog? Maybe there's actually a new level of parity that this young generation is experiencing for the first time. And so when they come here, it's a far different experience than the study abroad student who came in the 80s and the 90s. It's a sense that two things. First, I don't have to fully integrate as much as I used to, which many schools are seeing sort of as a bad thing. You're getting these large communities of Chinese students who hang out with these large communities of Chinese students and don't necessarily integrate into the larger community. On the other hand, it's an incredible product that their family gets to indulge in, some of the best education in the world, and then they get to take that education home and start their jobs with that foundation. So it's a unique mindset that this young generation has that no other generation in China could even really fathom.
Yeah. So one other year that I might throw in the mix for China's coming out would be 2007, 2008, mortgage crisis. China no longer seeing America as the inevitable model that it must follow. It can strike its own destiny. It can do things on its own terms and in its own way. I think we'll do just some fast reactions to the next couple of ones. So these are more foreign policy oriented. And then after that, we'll turn to your questions. So have some questions stewing, and then we'll turn to the audience in just a minute. Do you believe having an undergraduate education will guarantee professional success in China and Korea? Well, again, this was a community of students that were all in graduate school. So I think the answer to that is pretty evident in their response. Which country is most important for South Korea's economy and security? So these are the South Korean students only. And the blue responses were for the economy and the red for security. So you could see that just heavy focus on America. And I looked up a survey by the Asan Forum, which is a think tank in Korea. And for 2018, they do this polling regularly, and they break it down by age bracket. And the 20s and 30s were slightly more likely to lean towards America rather than to China. Of course, the reaction by the Chinese government, the informal sanctions over the missile defense battery that Korea and the U.S. decided to.
THAAD was a big turning point.
Big turning point. So
this is no surprise to me. I think the way that the United States-South Korean relationship has been portrayed within China, I think with a certain amount of fairness, it looks like that dependency is very strong, at least from looking from within China.
And I think that there's this perception within South Korea that the healthy choice for us is that values do matter, and something if we lean too far, if we hedge too far, then we put ourselves out on a limb. Then again, counterbalancing as well, given that China is such an important trade partner and source of investment, is another risk. So it's a very difficult tightrope to walk for South Koreans, and they perceived that, they felt that, and that was very evident in their responses as well.
I think most of the allies, especially over the last 2 years, are feeling a more precarious.
Sure, certainly.
It's a more precarious moment as the United States' stance is less clear than it's been in a while, and China's strength and particularly its effort to create these economic and political dependencies, not just in the East Asia, but the entire Asia extended region. I mean, it's becoming far more clear what China's up to.
In one sense, Xi Jinping couldn't have asked for anything better than an America that goes for bilateral relationships rather than multilateral relationships. So here's a question that I think you might have some comments to remark on. Which country is China's more important trade and security partner? So for security, it's their only two choices were North Korea or South Korea. So for security partner, they were a little bit split, but clearly the majority went with North Korea as their more important security partner, and then trade, of course, with South Korea, which is funny because North Korea has this overwhelming dependency on China for trade, but then China, it's an unbalanced relationship, has such a small trade relationship.
The trade relationship is a political tool almost exclusively in terms of the Chinese economy. It pretty much provides no benefit aside from that dependency.
Zach, thank you so much for coming today. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Zach for his great insights today. Thank you so much.